Analysis requires access to source material. Maybe it's the source that you want to critique or other sources that you want to critique it with. I always ask Berkeley students how they go find sources, and they almost always tell me that they just start by Googling stuff. I try to find it on Google Scholar, and my advice is always to not just use a standard search engine when you have already paid for access to a world-class library. Some of your Berkeley tuition goes towards the cost of the library, which negotiates and makes deals with other institutions to get you access to their databases. Um, and there's really a difference in the types of sources that we get when we search through the library search portal and standard search engines. There's a difference in the authors that we tend to encounter, uh, in the types of sources that we encounter as well. I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment with some examples, really, and also in the types of critiques and tone that we see. So, I mean, just as an example, here's something that you're likely to find through the library search node. Here is an article from a scientific journal, a journal that's focused on psychology, written by psychologists, where they look at Kanazawa, and they're talking about his argument, but instead of kind of reacting with outrage, they just are here to talk about the data. Let's look at his methods. Look at how Kanazawa tries to do X, Y, and Z with the data, right? But we're going to talk about his methods. His methods are flawed, right? And there's issues with the data. And this is, even though you can get from the title, mind the gap in theory, method, and data, that they're really out to trash Kanazawa in this piece, but they're doing so objectively, right? They're just talking about the data instead of just jumping to conclusions about how he's a crap psychologist or whatever. Compare this with something that you get through a standard web search. This is one of the first critiques of Kanazawa that comes up. It's on Scientific American, which, right, that sounds pretty reputable, right? But there's just when you compare this though, you start noticing issues about the tone. It's kind of subjective, it's a little kind of mean spirited. Uh, and there's a lot of stuff where the writer is here to attack the messenger rather than the message itself. Okay, you may not like Kanazawa, but what about his claims? What if it's true that he is a jerk, but he's right? You really have to attack the claims. Now, eventually, the writer starts to kind of pivot to that, but notice how instead of looking at the data herself, the author sends us to someone else. Well, okay, this other person has reviewed the data. Okay, that's fine. But if another person's reviewed the data, why am I reading this article? Why don't I just read this myself? Why am I relying on this writer to interpret the data for me? This is what we call the difference between a primary and a secondary source. This article here is a secondary source. It's talking about what other people have said. And this person is a journalist, right? Here you get something that is a primary source. These issues with the data that they're talking about, they did that analysis themselves, all right? And these are all kind of examples of the differences in sources that we find on library and a standard web search.